The importance of story in games cannot be understated. In Genshin, it's the driving force behind your journey across the land and your experiences alongside the characters you meet. In Blue Archive, the mystery and intrigue it sets up in the very beginning of the game through that one simple cutscene piques the player's interest enough to pull them into the game's plot. Both of these games take entirely different approaches to their story and entirely different approaches to pulling the player in and giving them a legitimate reason to care. Genshin Impact, for instance, chooses to instead focus on a journey about finding your sibling, and the intrigue and mystery behind that goal builds over time as you meet them and experience and learn more about their situation as well as yours. Blue Archive, in my opinion, takes a better approach to this. I briefly glossed over it in my previous video discussing the amazing thing that Blue Archive does, and it was mostly prioritizing the characterization. This video will also discuss that, but we'll also discuss the importance and impact that it has on a story as a whole. But first, hello everyone. If you're new to the channel, my name is Shikai. I primarily discuss and analyze these stories and characterization in video games. I discuss gacha games right now, such as Genshin Impact and Blue Archive. But if you have a different game you would like me to discuss, or a different game you think does something really well, feel free to leave that in the comment section down below. Now, back into Blue Archive. The game itself does put the story at the forefront at the very beginning. However, in my opinion, whilst it does push that story and narrative first and foremost, it also has its own intriguing ways to go about telling you that, even if you don't focus on the story itself. I, for instance, was intrigued by the story, but once I took a bit of a break from Blue Archive, I let that interest die down, and instead I primarily focused on the missions themselves as opposed to the story missions. Now, in most scenarios, what this would mean is that I would be less intrigued by the game as a whole, I would stop caring about the characters and what's happening. However, the opposite has happened. Despite putting down the story missions and not progressing in that sense, I have instead kept up with the story and I'm still intrigued by the characters. I discussed characterization and why that matters so much in Blue Archive and how it does it so well. I used previously Serena and Izuna as my primary examples because those are two of my favorite characters and the live 2D screens are amazing as well. However, I know there are a ton of characters in Blue Archive, and I know many of you who watch this video may have your own personal favorites. Tell me about them down below. But Blue Archive is amazing for setting up a character that maybe seems surface level or has a surface level amount of interest to them. Maybe you look at them and you decide, oh, you already know what type of person they are, you already know what type of personality they have, and as such, you're not intrigued. But because of the fact that you increase that relationship through lessons and through general cafe experiences, you are more than likely eventually going to max out that relationship rank, and eventually, especially if you want the currency that you need to roll, Pyrozeni, you're probably going to experience the relationship storyline. And if not that, you're probably going to experience it in the sub-missions or the sub-story missions that you have access to. In my personal experience, this is great. It's an amazing form of storytelling that doesn't rely on you having to look at the actual story itself. Even if you don't touch the story of Blue Archive, you don't touch those main missions, sure, you're missing out on a pretty large margin of the story. But the gameplay itself has other ways to draw you in. If you like a unit, you're inclined to pay attention to their relationships. If you're inclined to pay attention to who they like, who they interact with, and what storylines or submissions they're going to appear in. You may not care about the club or the school they specifically come from because for the most part, that may not interest you. However, if you like the character, you want to learn more about the interactions they may have, and that causes you to branch out in terms of your own knowledge. I've played games like Archetypes, games like Genshin Impact, games like Azure Lane, and I've played a couple other gachas here and there, and I primarily have played RPGs, Dragon's Dogma, The Witcher, etc. I've played many games that require or put the story first and foremost. Linear storytelling like The Last of Us or the Naughty Dog's Uncharted can be great games, and I primarily discussed this previously, how the storytelling in the game does impact and matter overall, not only to the player's expectations and their interests, but also to how you feel about certain units. But linear storytelling requires a lot of importance to be placed on not only keeping the player's interest with small sparkles of really exciting and action-packed events over time, but also it requires you to start off incredibly strong, because if you don't pique or pull the player's interest early on, you've lost them already. Blue Archive starts off strong by, in some way, shape, or form, pulling you in and trying to pique your interest. But the benefit of Blue Archive is it doesn't make you commit to a story that increases over time. It doesn't make you commit to a storyline that you really won't care about until later on. Instead, you may not care about it right now, but if you care about a character, you're going to subsequently learn about them, learn about their story, their school, their club, their interactions, and that's going to draw you into the main story. I feel like gacha games get a bit of a difficult reputation for storytelling because for the most part, most people are drawn in. The main reputation they get is either from the gameplay and graphics. For instance, Genshin Impact is primarily compared to Breath of the Wild, which I feel like pulled a vast majority of individuals into the game. Or you have games like Arknights and Blue Archive, both of which have beautifully designed gameplay aesthetics and gameplay mechanics. For instance, the skills look great a lot of the time, but the characters are mainly what people focus on, not their storylines first, but instead their appearance. I mean, if you're looking at the Blue Archive subreddit, you have a lot of art that gets uploaded to the top, so that appears to be the primary focus of the community. And I feel like because of this, a lot of individuals don't necessarily consider or at least discuss just how good or how impactful a story can be. They're instead focused on making a good game that looks pretty or a good game that feels nice to play. And this can be to a game's detriment or its betterment. I have played Arknights and I like the strategy of the game. I like the thought process required to complete certain tasks. I like the feeling of the gameplay and how each unit can theoretically specialize in something unique, and how a lot of times your success and your failure is entirely dependent on you as an individual. Are you placing people in the right place? What are you doing? However, this also means that despite that gameplay, the fact that I don't cover it often means I'm not necessarily interested in the story of the game itself. Now, don't get me wrong, lore and design can be a wonderful thing, but Arknights doesn't make me feel or care for a unit because there's no benefit to using them. An example is I could pick up a textbook and read about the history of a country. It doesn't mean I care about anything I just read. Arknights has that same feeling. Genshin, to a lesser extent, and Blue Archive is, in my opinion, the best at it. Building a relationship with a character and a unit is very difficult. Games can choose multiple methods of making you do that, whether that be telling you a story, like what Genshin chooses to do, or having you interact with them, like what Blue Archive chooses to do. Arknights instead chooses to have text. You can read pages and pages about their backstory. You can listen to certain audio logs, don't get me wrong, and that's fine too. But the difficulty is, in my personal opinion, even if you're looking at something like Blue Archive, which, let's be honest, doesn't have a bunch of cutscenes in it, it doesn't have many facial expressions, it has some but not much. Instead, the benefit Blue Archive does is it combines the minimal amount of expressions you will get with a unique text experience that puts you in a one-on-one interaction with the character you like. And because you're not just reading pages off a manual, which is what Arknights tries to do, you feel a bit more connected and a bit more immersed in that moment. Now, I'm aware my experiences, my opinions can be entirely different from yours, and if you think Arknights does great with its storytelling, hey, by all means, you're entitled to that opinion. I'm not going to disagree. Maybe I just haven't reached a point to where I feel as though the story has connected and impacted me, and I will try to. I will go in depth. I will play Arknights again. I will start over from the very beginning and pay attention to the story and try and find out what draws me into stories and games. But just from my current viewpoints and opinions, I would rank Blue Archive as the best at storytelling, with Genshin as a close second, because Genshin I'm immersed because of the gameplay, and Arknights would be last. Storytelling in video games is incredibly difficult because if you don't have a good gameplay loop, if you don't have something that really pulls me in or pulls the users in, you've lost them, and realistically at that point, why would we care about the events or cutscenes that are outplaying before us? Everything doesn't have to be voice acted. Everything doesn't have to have a unique or beautifully rendered cutscene. Instead, what is required is usually characters you like to look at or care about. For me, that's Izuna, that's Serena, that's Natsu, who is more recently released in Blue Archive. For you, that could be someone else entirely different. But I feel like the storytelling in gacha games is severely underplayed because a lot of gachas have great stories, and a lot of individuals won't really seem to want to admit that. I don't understand why. People will be much more inclined to say, oh hey, Genshin Impact just has funny or cool looking characters, than saying Genshin Impact has a good story. Or saying Blue Archive is only successful because of the art that is constantly drawn of its characters, rather than saying Blue Archive has a legitimately good story. And I want to bring attention to that. If you like this video, agreed, and I know the thoughts in this one weren't as centered because this is unscripted, unlike my first video on Blue Archive, so I apologize for that. But if you like this video, leave a like down below. Consider subscribing because I do want to cover more games in the future. I do want to cover storytelling as a whole. If you want me to look at a new character or an individual character in any game, leave that in the comment section down below. I will look at them, I will read their story, I will try and learn as much about them, and I will try to make an individual video focused on them as a character. Either way, I hope to see you next time. Subscribe, like, hit the notification bell, and goodbye.